So a lot of writers who have their work adapted to film or television are not really involved. They kind of hand it over, and sometimes that can create a distant or even adversarial relationship with the adaptation. You are not like that. You've been a producer on Game of Thrones, and you've also written scripts for some of the most iconic episodes, and I want to shout out a few of them, including you wrote The Pointy End, which has this amazing scene where Syrio Forel protects Arya as she escapes. Her life is never the same. Again, I hope this is like a spoiler-heavy zone, so you can feel free to exit behind you if you need to leave. So you wrote that episode that I love, Blackwater, incredibly epic, a battle that I think rivals Minas Tirith for great on-screen battles, where Tyrion proves himself to be a capable military strategist. We get lots of sweet dragon fire exploding. The Lion and the Rose, where we bid, for some of us, a very gleeful farewell to Joffrey. And we realize that we can see a minor die on TV, and we're somehow like happy about it, and then have to explore those feelings. So at the same time, so you're heavily involved in the show. I'm still speaking in the present tense, but
right.
You know, I'm working through my own things. But you're still writing this series, and you really reserve the right to do what you want there autonomously, not based on people's responses to the TV series. This is a long way of asking, how do you see the relationship between TV Westeros and fiction Westeros, and how are you operating in both of these worlds?
Well, how many children did Scarlett O'Hara have?
I'm the wrong one to ask that.
She had 3 in Margaret Mitchell's novel. She had 1 in the movie. So how many children did she have? I mean, which is right? The actual answer to that, it's a trick question, of course, is Scarlett O'Hara had no children because she's a fictional character and never existed. It's 2 different mediums and 2 different ways of telling the same story, or at least a similar story. And that's true whenever you adapt any work from television, or from books to television or movies, or even a radio play for that matter. You have to make choices as to what you leave in, what you take out. There are issues that a television producer or a screenwriter has that a novelist does not have. You know, you have to worry about the budget, you have to worry about the running time. You have actors who have contracts, you know, that have to be serviced. I could have a character like Theon Greyjoy or Varys disappear for entire books, and you know, not be mentioned at all, and perhaps be presumed dead, or at least they're off and you don't know what they're doing. You can't do that with a TV show. I mean, the actors are under contract. You're not going to pay an actor for an entire season and not have them appear on screen. Television and film have things at their disposal that the novelist does not have. They can have a score like the wonderful music we were hearing by Ramin Djawadi, or Emmy-winning composer, that you know, reinforces. We have marvelous special effects and all of that. But the novelist also has tools that the screenwriter and the director don't have. He can use an unreliable narrator. He has the wonderful strength, which I used very heavily in A Song of Ice and Fire, a point of view. The camera is completely objective. It has no point of view. The camera is showing you what happened. When I write a scene from the viewpoint of Sansa, I'm filtering everything through Sansa's perceptions. Sansa is only seeing what she's looking at. If there's something behind her, she doesn't see it. But it's more difficult to write when you're doing it with a camera. So all of these things necessitate making changes, making a different approach. So that's what the process of adaptation is about. And then it's up to the readers and the viewers to decide which they like better. They're both works of art. Margaret Mitchell's novel is there. It can be read. You can go see the 1939 movie. Still, though, if you take into account inflation and all that, still the highest grossing movie of all time. And you can determine which you like better and argue about how many children she should have had. But there it is. It's 2 different works of art, related but not identical.
Almost like alternate universe versions of each other. So initially, when people started showing interest in the series for television, you felt that the scale of it might be beyond what could be represented on film, especially because of partially what you just mentioned, the scope of your many characters, the world, the complexity of the plot. What do you think was the X factor? Is there something that changed or something that made it work despite those challenges of the medium?
Well, I think HBO was part of the H factor. HBO was willing to let us make an adult fantasy. Fantasy books had been dominating the bestseller lists for decades, but whenever fantasy was done for TV for Game of Thrones, they put it on at 8 o'clock, 7 Central, and it was in the family hour because the people running television thought fantasy, dragons and swords and stuff, that was something silly. It was just for children. HBO had enough faith to redefine, at least in terms of television, to redefine the fantasy genre. And that doesn't surprise me because if you look at what they did previously, right. Deadwood, whole new take on Westerns, Sopranos, completely different take on the gangster story. HBO was in the business of redefining genres and inverting tropes and turning them on their head. So they did it in fantasy. Also, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, the showrunners, did an amazing job, and they assembled a great team. Game of Thrones has won, at this point, more Emmys than any other show in the history of television, primetime show anyway. And what's interesting about it is many of those Emmys are what they call in Hollywood below the line. They're for things like music, costuming, casting, stunt work, all of these things, special effects. All of these things are necessary to do a good thing. And a novelist doesn't have to worry about that. I can just write what the costumes are, and I don't have to worry about that. But a showrunner has to put together a team of people who can do it, and who can do it, in the case of Game of Thrones, with extraordinary passion and skill to produce something that is really memorable and outstanding. And David Benioff and Dan Weiss did that. They put together one of the greatest production teams and cast and crews in the entire history of television, I think.
I think the costume, I mean, there's so many of those things you just mentioned that I could shout out, but the costuming in particular, right? We see characters I'm thinking of Daenerys, obviously, right? And the kind of progression of costuming over the course of their personal development as a character.
Yeah, definitely. Everything plays a role. And all it takes is one person to screw up, and you're watching the first episode of some new fantasy show, and it seems to be promising, and the dialogue is good, and maybe the special effects are good, and then you spot a zipper, and suddenly your suspension of disbelief is out the window, and you say, what the hell, and they've lost you. No, you have to get everything right. It's being a showrunner of a major television show is really a difficult achievement.